Good afternoon, everyone. Buenas tardes a todos y todas. My name is Denise Ledgard. I'm UNDP's Peru Democratic Governance Team's leader, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the workshop addressing the gender dimensions of corruption in Latin America and Caribbean. This workshop is organized by UNDP, specifically by UNDP's Latin America Regional Hub, and the UNDP's Global Anti-Corruption Program, and UNDP, the Peruvian office. What we are going to talk about is probably where is that intersection between gender and corruption. And I must begin acknowledging that research on corruption has not addressed enough the differential impact of corruption on women and men. Studies are still scarce, and it seems that there's a lack of interest from either agendas because they feel that the point is washed out and not added up. This is specifically important if one considers the recommendation that CEDAW, for example, makes to the states to address corruption in the justice system. However, it is known, especially from the effects of the pandemic, that corruption hits women harder, since it affects the socio-political and economic system in which women are normally more exposed to vulnerability. And also, there's one big problem that our panelists are going to address, that is the lack of data on the concrete impact of corruption on women and gender perspective in integrity policies. These are some of the issues that motivate today's workshop, and to answer them, we are joined by 4 specialists who I have the honor to present. I have on my left Ana Linda Solano. Ana is consulting lawyer and in criminal law, criminal policy, and criminal investigation, with an emphasis on money laundering, corruption, and organized crime. She's also a research professor at the Externado de Colombia University and the Latin American Academy of Investigation of Financial and Tax Crimes of the OECD. She has been the main expert of the Women and Corruption initiative of the European Union Cooperation Program, EUROsociAL, and national coordinator of the bilateral anti-narcotics strategy of Colombia and the United States. Then, on the other extreme, I have María Jaraquemada. María is the executive director of the Chilean chapter of Transparency International, Chile Transparente. She has worked at the Transparency Council at the Minister General Secretariat of the Presidency as a legislative advisor and coordinator of the Anti-Corruption Observatory and the Latin American Anti-Corruption Network, as well as program officer for Chile and the Southern Cone at International IDEA. Then I have on my right Marcela Huaita. Marcela is Peruvian, the same as me, is the head of the Office for Gender Equality and Diversity at the Pontificia Universidad Católica del Perú. As an expert in gender issues, human rights, and public policy, she has held several public positions, including Minister of Women and Vulnerable Populations of Peru, President of the Inter-American Commission of Women of the Organization of American States, and in 2018, she was appointed as independent expert at the Committee of Experts of the follow-up mechanism of the Convention of Belém do Pará, exercising as president for the period 2022 to 23. On my left, I have Anga Timilsina. Anga is currently the UNDP's Global Program Advisor on Anti-Corruption. Anga is responsible for coordination of UNDP's anti-corruption support at the global level and provides overall supervision and guidance to the UNDP's Global Anti-Corruption Project titled Anti-Corruption for Peaceful and Inclusive Societies, which is UNDP's flagship initiative for policy and program support to UNDP program countries. So having said all of that, having presented all these experts, and a very summarized resume for each of them, I would like to start probably with a question, a broad question, and then each one of them will have around 7 minutes to intervene. So my first question would be, why is it important to highlight a difference in the impact of corruption in gender, and what do you consider are the main challenges or opportunities in dealing with this complex problem, particularly in a region like Latin America and the Caribbean? So I will give the word first to Anga. Please, Anga.
Thank you, Denise, and good afternoon, everyone. I realize that I am the only male balancing gender in the panel and also representing 2 or 3, 4, I guess, male in this workshop. But on a serious note, I also have my global program manager, Aida, sitting in green there. She always teases me by saying that you are our gender champion. So this topic is also my passion. And in UNDP, we started working on gender in 2008. We keep saying that, anti-corruption is relatively a younger profession compared to gender or human rights. We are celebrating 20th year of United Nations Convention Against Corruption next year. It's not that young, but if you compare the Human Rights Charter, going back to 75 years, the feminism movement, and so on, anti-corruption is relatively younger profession. But when the United Nations Convention came into force in 2005, then immediately in UNDP in 2008, together with UNIFEM, at that time the predecessor of UN Women, we conducted a study just to understand the gender dimension in these several regional and global anti-corruption convention, and also to understand what we really mean by mainstreaming anti-corruption in gender or gender in anti-corruption. We are still struggling with this, and Dennis is very right. And then in 2011, both Aida and I led a study on what is the grassroots women's perspective on both corruption and anti-corruption and how they define corruption, for example. Is it different than how male would like to define? We had 11 country case studies from Latin America to Africa to Asia. I'll come back to that point. And then more recently, last year, we also commissioned a paper, a study, to find out linkages between the contemporary forms of slavery. In UN, we call contemporary forms of slavery, but it's modern slavery, basically. And what is the gender dimension there in that aspects. So overall, here is the situation, and I'm sure Marcela and Anna and Maria, they will bring up some Latin America and the Caribbean context specific example. But globally, this is what's happening. First of all, we have now more knowledge about the impact of corruption on men and women. We have more knowledge. I'm not saying that, we need to do more. So data disaggregation and so on, I'll come back to that point. But I think if you ask a reasonable person, whether a researcher, academician, or practitioner, and they agree that women are impacted more than men. It's partly because what Dennis was mentioning earlier, because women are more exposed to vulnerabilities. And corruption is an issue of power, issue of influence, issue of inequality, issue of service delivery, whether it's justice sector or whether it's health service delivery. And that's why there is more impact. But on the other hand, in terms of addressing the gender dimension of corruption, addressing part, we are not quite there. I'll give you 3 examples. First of all, we still have this gender neutral approach When you look at the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, or African Convention Against Corruption, or Latin, Inter-American Convention and so on, or the bribery, OECD bribery convention, yeah, they don't mention, like a gender dimension there. So they are treating that corruption is gender neutral. Mostly about money, by the way. There is no this, trust element, misuse of, the power element, and also the issue of sextortion and so on, physical abuse. And then the second point is that we still have gaps in measurement. Although the Sustainable Development Goals, SDG 16 and other goals, we have provided guidance from the UN that we need to collect gender disaggregated data, but we are not quite there on illicit financial flows, on bribery, on corruption, because simply we didn't have a standard methodology. Now we have methodology to collect those data, but data collection is very, very scanty, and we are not there. And then the question is, if we don't have data, how do we know whether the women business leaders are they have more integrity than the men, for example? Whether the women leaders are better in fighting corruption than men. If we don't have data, it's difficult to inform policies. So we need to do more in terms of data collection. There is still huge gaps in measurement. And then the other point is, it's also gap in defining corruption from a gender perspective. I already mentioned that. Yeah, most of our definition either deal with money, illicit financial flows, embezzlement, money laundering, bribery, you name it, illicit enrichment, and so on. But the main part on sextortion or physical abuse and others, because the reason why I am saying is that we had a study, I mentioned earlier, the grassroots women's perspective on corruption and anti-corruption. For example, in Uganda, if a man goes to get a, let's say, land entitlement in the office, most likely the officer will ask for, money, meaning that the physical money, But if a young woman goes for the same land entitlement, they don't ask even for money. They might ask something else. So that's why the definition which we have right now, globally, regionally, or in our national legislation, so it's not enough. We really need to work on that. And this brings to my last point, which is, yesterday, I think, when we were preparing for this panel discussion, one thing which struck to my mind, which is, in most of our national laws and legislations, there is also, on the one hand side, we have a human rights perspective. On the other hand side, we have this anti-corruption perspective. For example, if the penal code is not really, defining the big, defining sextortion as a big thing, then it is most likely that, the human rights penal code will say that, oh, this is just a, sexual abuse, a minor thing, or the anti-corruption legislation would say that, oh, this is a little bribery. But the case is big. So we still need to resolve this issue, bringing these two penal codes together. And yeah, we will discuss that in the solution part. So let me stop here for this part. Thank you.
Thank you, Anga. Thank you, Anga. And I think it's very important to have the global perspective and then of corruption and the need of a multi-dimensional way of looking at it. And now we are moving to Latin America. We are going with Ana Linda Solano.
Thank you, Denise. Very happy to be here and share this panel with you. And I applaud UNDP for this initiative. Thank you so much. What the gender dimension adds to understanding and addressing corruption, and vice versa, is, as you were saying, Anga, a multidimensional relation. And just addressing the impacts, we know that corruption disproportionately affects vulnerable people. It's not just on a gender base, but it's also if you're a migrant, age, different vulnerable contexts. So disproportionately affect the people that depend on public budgeting and in other actions. But the important thing here is that when we are talking about impacts, we're not talking about this disproportionate affection, but also that there are specific forms of corruption that become visible when we use gender lens. And one form is precisely what Anga was saying, sextortion, a form of sexual corruption. But whenever we're addressing gender and corruption, we go this path. We think mostly about sextortion, probably because it's what we understand better. Anyone could be a victim of sextortion, abuse of power in order to access to health, education, justice, security, to all of these public services. But what happens is that it happens disproportionately to women. And Peru have some measurements, and we know the 2019 barometer also measures this, and it's something that have a gender dimension. Okay. But when we address sextortion, we address it as a petty corruption case, because it's the one that is between two different, an agent and a civil, someone from society that needs to access to this. What Anga was trying to say is that somehow we need to redefine that this gender lens also make us think that we need to redefine what we consider corruption and the way we classify corruption. Because I don't think that when we're talking about forms of corruption that directly affect human rights, like sexual violence or other forms of violence, in this case, we're talking about petty corruption. We're talking about a form of grand corruption with a human rights dimension. So this is a first approach to it. Second of all, when we think about gender and corruption and trying to take it out of just situations of petty corruption, something else comes to my mind, and it is the corruption that enables organized crime or other forms of grand criminal transnational organizations or other forms. And this happened in illegal mining, and this happened in many manifestations of these illicit economies. It's more clearly for us to see it in human trafficking, the corruption that enables human trafficking. There are many studies that says it's not poverty, for example, the main reason for human trafficking. It is corruption. If you take away corruption from the sum of factors that affect and make it possible to have human trafficking, then you wouldn't have it. It's the main factor. But at the same time, it amazes me that the strategies regarding corruption or the strategies regarding human trafficking doesn't work together. So you don't have specific actions necessarily addressing corruption that enables or sometimes even leads this type of organized crime, or in most cases, organized crime. We have, for example, some typologies working with the prosecutor's offices from Latin American region. We found many typologies, different typologies. We have documentation, for example, to say a minor it's an adult, to licenses for places to work, migration documents, I mean, a lot of different scenarios. Protection to operate. We had a case in Peru with the head of the prosecution's office regarding human trafficking, who tipped the criminal organization that something was going to happen. He was part of the criminal organization in Madre de Dios, a very well-known zone for illegal mining and human trafficking. The impunity in the judicial system, and there are some cases, for example, in Argentina, where the judicial system enables, without acting, that this continues to happen. So the same cases kept arriving to the same office, and nothing happened for a very long time, 16 years. So imagine how many women was exploited through this. Public servants are head of networks because of their, abuse of power. They have the possibility, so you have mayors, this is a lot of different actors. When we think about this, we think about, policemen or something that is more close to a person. No, these are criminal networks. So the corruption that enables organized crime forms as human trafficking is also a form of grand corruption. And imagine migrant situation in Latin America, imagine those scenarios. But we also have manifestation of more systemic or state-captured corruption. And some cases in Central America, I know Guatemala, Panama, and some others, women are the ones that vote the most. So there are many initiatives to incentivize women vote, but also they are the ones more dependent to public programs. So you have a lot of vote buying through public programs, not just because they are for women, but also because women usually have the caregiver or the caretaker role. So they are the ones that need to access to those programs. So you have a lot of vote selling attached to social programs. The problem with that is that whenever you need this, whenever you win, so you need to pay back to the people that illicitly finance your campaigns. So the way to pay back is through public procurement. I define my public procurement through my friends and the ones that I have to pay back. So that means that my programs, my social programs, my public policy is defined by these types of friendships. So that's why we need to think this as in a systemic way. When we talk about gender and corruption and their relation, we're not talking just about one crime, sextortion, a form of sexual corruption. We need to understand the whole phenomena and the whole different dimensions and specific forms that it can occur.
Thank you, Ana Linda. I think that complements what Anga was saying about the multidimensional aspects, and also give us an idea of the need to address this as a systemic corruption and how this impacts in a different way for women. Now we'll have Marcela Huaita.
Hello, I am very happy to share with you this workshop in this Anti-Corruption Day 2022 with all of you in person, but also with people who is connected online. So I want to go deep in human rights. Corruption is a complex phenomenon that affects the enjoyment and exercise of human rights and increase gender inequality. Corruption affects the civil and political rights of women. For example, when public contribution to political parties to promote the participation of women in politics are not expensed aimed at benefiting them because someone thinks that it is not important to contribute to their participation and take these funds for other activities. This happened in Chile in 2016 when the law established that 10% of public contribution to party organizations should promote the participation of women in politics. And a subsequent investigation about the use of electoral funds showed that in 33 parties, this expense was not directed at effectively contributing to women participation. Corruption affects economic, social, cultural, and environmental rights when bribes are requested in educational, health, and other social services, taking advantage of the vulnerable position of many women. This is even worse with respect to mothers who are head of households, since the various forms of systematic corruption disproportionately affect women who, in many cases, have a greater dependence on this resource for themselves and their families. Case of political clientelism through social policies also directly affect them due to the direct relationship with the administration of their family's basic needs. This happened in Ecuador, where according to the LAPOP 2019 survey, 26% of the women surveyed who have school-age children has been asked for bribes in the education system, constituting the category with the most record of women affected by bribes. Corruption affects the sexual and reproductive rights of women when they are victims of trafficking or when they are engaged in sex work, because sex workers are a sector that is exposed to various forms of violence, and some of them are linked to corruption maneuvers. Those that need to pay bribes to the police or other public officials to carry out the activity is a permanent risk. This happens in all our countries with migrant women when the police and other officials take advantage of their fear of deportation due to their irregular immigration status, and different forms of sexual extortion take place, where the payment of bribes that they are demanding of women is not only in money, but also for sexual acts. We can know about it in the daily news in our Latin American countries, and this is why we are here.
Thank you very much, Marcela. And we're going to Chile with María.
Thank you very much, and I'm very glad to be here, and thank you for the invitation to the UNDP Peru. I want to share with you some information that we have collected from Chile. We participated in a study led by Poder Ciudadano, the Argentinian chapter of TI, who I suppose they are very happy because I think they are winning the game. And that's why they're not here. There's a first thing, as Anga was saying, there's a lack of data in many of our countries to really assess how corruption impacts women in difference with men. But we have some data collected, and we can see that this is a fact. And if you see a lot of reports or studies from the UNDP, from TI, the World Bank, IDB, etc., IMF, we all agree with this issue, but we are lacking, as Analinda was saying, public policies that really takes care of this issue. As Anga was saying, women and girls are more vulnerable in our countries. In Chile, for example, we are not the poorest country in the region, but women are the poorest person in the country, and we don't see it probably in the streets, but the higher percentage of homeless people are women in Chile. So there's the more impact they suffer, for example, in some issues, it's in accessing public health and public education. Women in Chile are the main users of the public health system. And there are data that they have more problems than men accessing to appointments and medicines, and this also affects her sexual health. 18% of women said that they had paid bribes to access to the public health system, 5% more than men. Also, in public education, there are reports that women are having more problems accessing to this education for their kids, and they have to pay bribes, or they are victims of sextortion to access to the education. There's also a report done by Universidad de Chile, our national public university, that 26% of students was victim of sextortion to access to some academic opportunities. Many of these persons were women. There's a lack of public awareness and criminalization about sextortion. For example, we had recently a case where a former mayor of a city in the south of Chile was asked by a woman for subsidies or benefits in the first months of the pandemic. He invited her to his house and then sexual harassed her. He was recently sanctioned with 4 years, not in prison, in his house for years, but for sexual harassment, and the corruption aspect was not considered. So, for example, when you are sanctioned with corruption crimes, you are inhabilitated for public office for some time. This was not considered. So that's the problem when we don't have the corruption perspective in these issues. And also, we don't, in the data that we have, the statistics of our country, this case is not considered as corruption. We also have some information about that women, in some surveys, women trust more in the public entities. They reject more the corruption, but they have less disposition to report or to whistleblower than men. For example, in the public sector, 75% versus 70%, and in the private sector, 72 versus 68%. They fear retaliation, they have shortage networks of support, and state protection. When you see, for example, our data about the Freedom of Information Act, women are the ones who use it more. They ask for more information, but when information is not given, they file less reports to the Transparency Council than men. They prefer to make the requirements by phone or presential, and with the pandemics, that is over. So now we have digital channels or digital mechanisms, but women in Chile prefer the other mechanisms. And this is not considered when we create some of the reporting mechanism for corruption or other issues. So the absence of gender perspective in this issue is affecting women. As Marcela was saying, we have a law that obliges political parties to spend at least 10% of the public financing to promote women participation. In the first months, some of the parties, for example, painted their offices with pink. Another party made a barbecue and invited a humorist with all the women of the party. That were the ways that they were promoting political participation. And we have, since 2016, a quota in the parliamentary elections, 40%, but when we saw the financing, the funding of women candidates, men at least had 2 times more financing than women, especially from the political parties. In the Constitutional Convention that we had last year and this year, I don't know if you know, but we had a constitutional process that failed, and we are discussing about a second constitutional process now. We had parity. So we had 50% of women and men. And the data is similar. You had the same number of candidates because it was mandatory, and you had 60% of the funding going to men candidates and 39% going to women. So we can see that there are a lot of obstacles, because when you don't have women representation, it's very difficult to have gender perspective in the public policies. As you can see, we have a different approach. We have a neutral approach to corruption public policies, and this is affecting women, and we are not considering this. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. And even though I'm very jealous because in Peru, for example, the political participation, we haven't had one regional governor in Peru, like a women. And even we have like a parity law in the last election that were just now in November. The results were just surprising. And now we have a female president, but that's not elected by people, unfortunately. So, yes, as everything that happens sometimes in Peru. But now we thought it was very important not only address these differential impacts or the different dimensions of the gender and corruption issues, but we thought it would be very interesting for you also to know what are we doing in Latin America and the Caribbean and what still needs to be done or should be done, and where should an agenda in the region, in the Latin American region, go. So I will give first the mic to Anga.
Okay. Well, it's a fascinating dialogue, you know, and I think, yeah, I mean, I really appreciate everyone's contribution in the panel. So now, when we talk about solution, you know, I would like to at least highlight 3-4 key points, which have already been introduced, by the way, in the previous segment. I think Anna mentioned earlier about, you know, the linkage between organized crime and the gender dimension. So I think, you know, we cannot continue talking about gender dimension of corruption in abstract. You know, that's yeah. We need to move to more to a sectoral approach. What I mean by this is, let me explain. Let's look at justice sector, for example, you know, and then see how gender, you know, dimension of corruption is impacting it. Then let's go to the service delivery sector. You know, sometimes we always make this analogy. Fighting corruption is like eating a big, you know, elephant-like creature. Meaning that, how do we do that if that's the situation? And we we always say that then we eat piece by piece, you know. Yeah, it has to be a, you know, step-by-step approach. So yeah, let's look at justice sector and see the gender dimension of impact. Let's see the service delivery sector, you know, whether education, health, and so on, and see what's the gender impact dimension are there and what solution we can propose. And then let's see the, you know, the human trafficking sector or migration in that context. And I can go and go, you know. So I also think that one sector might, you know, in one sector, women might be even more vulnerable than the other sector. Like the justice sector, for example. You know, usually the case of sextortion in many countries is a power thing. You know, women simply don't want to go in front of judges there because there is social stigma attached to it. Because you live in the same community. Unless there is protection, you know, whether whistleblower protection, witness protection, and all these mechanism, you know, enforcement of all these mechanism. So yeah, my proposal is let's look at sector by sector. I think there needs more study on this. The second thing, which I also mentioned earlier, you know, data, and data. If you have more data, then it will be, you know, easier for changing in policies and so on. And thanks to Peru, at least you have a barometer now. But what we also need to do is a little bit more clarity on typologies. When we collect data, you know, there has to be standardization in typologies, what we are actually collecting and what we want to collect, that data for what. What we want to do from that data. Then the other thing, I think, you mentioned very well earlier about voice and participation. At the end of the day, if we don't have enough women, you know, having seats on the table, forget about it. You know, there might be 1 or 2% like me, passionate with that gender issue. But if you have more women on the table in the decision making, in representation, there are two things. One, they know the problem. You know, they have gone through that problem. And then that's why they are passionate about that. And then the second issue is the fairness. You know, we always keep saying that women comprise the half of the sky. But when we look at representation, very low. You know, only a few countries might be fortunate enough to have. So that's why we need to do more in terms of, you know, participation, political, women's participation in politics and businesses and everywhere. But we have laws. You know, like in Nepal, we have, I come from Nepal. In Nepal, constitution is written there must be 33% participation. But when they form cabinet, the government, you hardly see one woman included. And they say, oh, well, we have a woman in our cabinet. Talking women, I have seen that in many corporate sectors too. There are rules, there are laws, there are, you know, those provisions, but they are not simply enforced. Yeah, there is this the political problem there. The other thing is this digital divide. You know, when we were mentioning earlier that women would like to have information, access to information using the traditional channel. This has to do with digital divide. There is huge digital divide between men and women when we talk about this new digital tools and so on. So we also need to bridge that gap in order to strengthen access to information, rights to information, and so on. And then the final point, I think I already mentioned that, these penal codes, you know, we need to have more, you know, the clear penal codes so that investigators and prosecutors know what they are exactly investigating and charging for, so that they do not trivialize, you know, a bigger problem to a smaller problem. So I think, you know, if we have at least few countries doing it, I am sure it can become a regional or global, you know, standards or movement on that. So let me just stop here.
Thank you, Anga. Marcela?
In this part, I want to invite you all to use the human rights framework to fight against corruption, but also to fight against gender inequality. The human rights framework can be significant for a positive synergy in the fight against corruption and the guarantee of human rights with a gender approach. First of all, I want to highlight the report that in 2019 has made by the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights about corruption and human rights, based on Inter-American standard, where the Commission takes a broad look at the relationship between human rights and the corruption that affect our regions, but also examines the effect of corruption on groups who have historically suffered discrimination, such as women and LGBTQ+ community. Secondly, I want to refer to some cases where the Inter-American Court has recognized situation of structural corruption which has affected crucial aspects of democratic institutions and implies impunity for those involved and the violation of women's rights due to inaction of the state based on corruption. I am particularly referring to the case of feminicides in Ciudad Juárez, better known as the Campo Algodonero versus Mexico case, which deals with the rape and subsequent murder of 3 low-income young women who were kidnapped, raped, and tortured, and then murdered, and their remains abandoned in a cotton field. In this case, the court causally linked the structural gender discrimination recognized by the state itself with the inefficient response and documented in different attitudes regarding the investigation of those crimes, which were rooted in structural corruption that affect the justice institution, such as the police, which without doubt contribute to the perpetuation of this type of violence in Ciudad Juárez and to high rate of impunity for crimes with characteristics of sexual violence. Taking as a background both the understanding of the Inter-American Commission and the Court on how corruption affects women's human rights, it's time to face new challenges. It's time to make use of both regulatory framework to sanction states that allow conditions of structural corruption that deepen the violation of women's human rights as in case of trafficking in women for the purpose of sexual exploitation, which at this moment is a major problem promoted by the migratory phenomenon in our region. We must improve the interpretative element in the legal field through studies and research that allow a greater development of the doctrine, but also through strategic litigation, which help us to develop a specific set of human rights standards on this matter. We need to work in the Inter-American human rights system to link the American Convention on Human Rights, the Inter-American Convention Against Corruption, and the Inter-American Convention to Prevent, Punish, and Eradicate Violence Against Women, or Convention of Belém do Pará, to prevent corruption and structural discrimination from deepening forms of violence that disproportionately affect women. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcela. I will go very quick to you, Maria. So we'll have some time for questions from the public afterwards.
Thank you. I think that based in what they all have said, the main challenge we are facing is to really consider the gender perspective on corruption policies. For example, when we design the reporting mechanisms, when we criminalize sextortion, when we train justice operators or other public officers who face different issues like accessing to public health, etc. And for example, we did an exercise of asking migrant women about their perception of sextortion in Chile. It is not representative because it is difficult for us to get them to talk because they are afraid of participating in some of these studies. But as other studies, we have data that they have a low self-perception of being victims of sextortion, 25%. It's not a low number, but 25% reported that they had been victims of sextortion. But there's a general perception of 55% of the women that participated in the study that sextortion is an issue and that other people suffer this crime. And there's a low disposition to report because they are scared of retaliation, because they have low trust in public institutions, and because they think that there are no consequences. So I think that this is something that we have to consider when we design this reporting mechanism and when we design our policies of whistleblowing, for example. We, as other chapters of Transparency International, we have a legal advice center for whistleblowers, and we received more reports from men, but all the numbers said that women are more victims or affected by corruption. So why that is happening? And they are the main caretakers, so there are studies from Colombia, for example, that there are gender stereotypes that are some of the reasons because women don't report, and because they are afraid, for example, to lose their employments if they report. And last thing, that this is very important, and we've been speaking this with Analinda, but in most of our institutions, when we sanction bribes, we sanction the one who receives the bribe and the one who gives the bribe. So if you sanction sextortion, there's a chance that the victim can be also criminalized. So that's the problem when you don't address corruption crimes, for example, with the gender perspective. So, as Anga was saying, we need more data because without the data and without the numbers, all these phenomena are invisible.
Thank you, Maria. So, Analinda, we'll close this part of the presentation.
Thank you, Denise. I recently heard anti-corruption expert from Chile. He said, you don't fight corruption fighting corruption. Like, you have to address the institutional weaknesses, and you have to address the weaknesses in governance in order to truly fight corruption. Because if you understand corruption as a complex system, it will adapt. It will create forms of adaptation resistance. It's a living thing. So just fighting it won't be enough. You need to address what's in deep. And this remind me of, one of the different theories regarding the relation between women and corruption. There's an author, Sung, he did some empirical research, and he came with the result that it's not the fairer sex, who is better anti-corruption. It's not the fairer sex, but the fairer system that both level of corruption and women participation in decision-making and in positions of power depends on other conditions, like rule of law, freedom of speech, electoral democracy. So it's the liberal democratic institutions that helps to have less numbers of corruption and good governance with gender equality. Yeah. So I just wanted to think deeper, because both things happen because something is lacking in our institutions, in our systems. So my invitation is to think, to address these solutions in terms of systemic solutions, sustainable solutions, but also effectiveness when we address it. Because somehow we are happy having a law, or we are happy with the superficial reform, or a survey with data about what we are going to do with that, as you were saying, Nanja. So we have two very relevant things regarding, for example, access to information. So we need, and women, as you were saying, Maria, are the ones that ask more for information. But what if we don't have interoperability? What happened the most in this system? Or the quality of the databases, the quality of the information that is there, or worst, a security issue. In our countries, in Colombia, demanding information is a security issue, and women have been threatened their lives because of asking information. If you remember that when we say that public procurement is somehow co-opted, asking about it is not gonna be a good thing. So when we talk about access to information, it's not just the title access to information, the quality of the information, interoperability of the platforms and all that, and the security issues. You need to audit, to control the quality from a technical perspective, but also from the quality of the information that you have there. And also going deeper is a cultural thing. We have to enforce the cultural, the ethics. When we think about anti-corruption, we mostly think in terms of crimes. We have to address these crimes, but we have also to construct ethical environments. And the way, for example, you select people. I recently heard, like, why if all the time migrant officials are the ones that are asking for this sexual favor, why you continue hiring that type of people? Why don't you have better selection processes or better accountable processes? And the London police, the police of London, because this is not just a Latin American problem, they did an assessment with all of the different typologies where policemen that were supposed to protect victims, refugees, and all of this were involved in forms of sexual corruption, and what they have to do in order to prevent this selection. So the selection processes are very sensitive and relevant in this type of thing. As Maria was saying, with whistleblower protection and all that. So if we were going to make a package just for this gender and corruption topic, I will put 4 things in that package. Not this general dimension that I was talking, but something that addresses specifically the topic. So one is understanding. I come from an investigative background. I was an investigator police. So you need to understand your threat, the phenomena. not just data in terms, as you were saying, empirical data, that's very relevant, but we don't have to fall down the rabbit hole of if we don't have data, we don't have anything to do. We need to understand the threat. So having assessments to understand, and some in the region have done it. Argentina have some assessment. Colombia, Transparente International have done some assessment. We need to understand our threat, because in order to know what to do, we need to understand what's happening. And risk assessment, country assessment, as we know in money laundering, for example, we have country risk assessments. We have to do that to understand where are these specific positions, situations, sectors, as you were saying, where this type of thing is mostly to happen. We need to overcome this data bias, because I don't know if you know this woman, Caroline Criado Perez. She has this book, Invisible Woman, and she talks about data bias. And what happens is that data bias is in everywhere and in everything that we deal with. Corruption is something more. So we need to overcome this data bias, but also we need to know what to do if we have it. And I adore a prosecutor in a conference in Peru, because she was a gender violence prosecutor, not anti-corruption. And having these discussions, she said, so for me, it is as easy as asking 2 more questions when I'm receiving a complaint. I should ask, this person was a public official, this person asked something in exchange for you, and that will make the whole difference for the case you were saying. And yes, it's as simple as that. It's trying to understand from your position as a public servant, as a prosecutor, as a judge, or as a civil society, what you can do, as this prosecutor was asking herself. Creating dialogues, funding, Maria, as you were saying, like, I want to do this with Colombia, Chile, and Peru, but there's not enough money. Like, we need funding for that, but we also need to be creative. We need tools, legislative tools, and in Latin America, we have some countries, Peru, Chile, Brazil. Some of them are working on legislative changes in order to create the crime of extortion. There's some debate in the criminal area, but as a police, the head of the anti-corruption police in Chile told me once, if no one tells me that I have to investigate precisely that, I won't do it. So it's the same that happened, for example, with feminicides, that if you don't make it visible with its unique characteristics, it will be very difficult for law enforcement and for everyone to do it. So that's why we have some projects in the region. And I know, for example, that Parlatino, which is like the group of parliaments in the region, they are working on a model law in order to address this. We need, of course, preventive tool. I'm not going to deep on that because Maria and Marcela talk about it, and Anga. But I want to address the part of how you address, for example, the investigative challenges that you are going to have. Because this is not just understanding that you need to create a route for attending these cases. In some countries, for example, in Peru, you see it as corruption. But the victim, whenever the case is decided, the survivor is not rewarded because it's considered that it's an offense against the government. So the government is the one receiving so that's a double victimization. Some other countries, as Maria was saying, see it as a sexual offense. So the aspect of corruption, abuse of power is impugned, so they keep doing it. So how to address it fully? Of course, the legislative change, but we need to create a route of attention. So whenever this case comes to my office, what should we do with it? We have to integrate task forces. We need different, because an anti-corruption investigator, he doesn't know how to deal with sexual abuse proofs. He knows how to do with accountable things, but how he's going, or vice versa, the sexual expert, how is he going to deal with the abuse of power component? So we need to integrate these 2, 3 roles, the human rights. I mean, we need to integrate that, but make clear routes of attention of these cases and how law enforcement is going to deal with that. I wanted to close, Denise, a judge asked me in one course, I was explaining a case in a prison where the spouse of this person who was in prison, she was the payment for him to access to cigarettes and some good things in prison. So the way he paid was with money and with sexual favors of his spouse. This is a case in Guatemala that the Public Defender's Office of Guatemala explained me. So I was explaining this in a course, and a judge, a woman judge, she told me, like, okay, but why criminal procedure have to deal with that? That is, I mean, why we have to enter to see that? And why, I mean, this woman should be accustomed to that. Why we have to deal with that? Because, I mean, she should be accustomed if that happens every time that she goes to prison to visit her husband. And that makes me think that we truly need to address this, because this is a judge from the Supreme Court of this country. I don't want to say the country, but this is a true story. So whenever we talk about this, we say it is invisible, there's no data, you know, all that. But I think that there's a deeper problem, and it is that it is normalized, that for many people to ask for this, and for many people to be in that situation, it is normal. So that's why in many contexts, there's why it isn't enough data, because I don't see it as a corruption, I don't see it as a sexual offense. I see that the prosecutor is giving more attention to my case, so he's gonna resolve it better. It's part of the form that things happen. So I think that we need to beat, from a cultural perspective, this normalization of these things. And that brings up back to the more systemic cultural ethic dimension of the problem. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ana Linda. So finally, I would like to open the floor for questions from the public. So if you have some questions, I will take them, maybe 2 or 3, or maybe it depends how many are there. So you have one. No, just a second. Yeah.
Thank you all for your presentation. My name is Ursula Indacochea. I work at the Due Process of Law Foundation. And I want to bring to your attention and all of the audience to another kind of situation in which a fight against corruption can have a gender perspective. And it's a case of Guatemala, in which women prosecutors that were complying with instructions from their male bosses, or women lawyers that are defending prosecutors or justice operators that are being criminalized because they were fighting against corruption. There's this backlash against justice operators that were fighting against corruption is focused on women. So you see that even though they're going back to those honest and independent judges and prosecutors, the people who are being incarcerated are the women prosecutors, are the women investigators, are the women lawyers. And this is because they are less likely to go to exile, to abandon their families, for example. So I think that, of course, sextortion is one of the biggest problems, but there are other dimensions, gender dimensions on the fight against corruption that I think we need to address. And maybe we have to think about special protection for women that are key actors in the fight against corruption in our countries, judges, prosecutors, and also human rights defenders that are denouncing corruption. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there any other question? Or I can pass to the panel. Who wants to address? Marcela, Ana Linda?
Yes, I agree absolutely with what you say, because women have a vulnerable position even when they are dealing with this case, because they have more more difficult to have this support of the system. So we need to develop this that Ana Linda say, understand deeply what is going on in the cultural system to bring support. So I think it is very important to document this type of case and to bring attention of all the community that are working in corruption, and to focus on this kind of situation, because you say one in Guatemala, but we know that there is some other case that women are in big problem, and they don't get support at all when they are in this position. So I think we need to document and to understand what is going on in the system.
Anyone else?
Well, I think, thank you for bringing the, the another dimension on gender and corruption. I think it's also overall true with anti-corruption champions around the world. You know, during last 5 years, actually in EU, there were 5 murder of journalists, even in European Union, from Monaco to, all these countries. And I think, I think there are 2 issues here. One is, again, going back to my point on representations. You know, if you have both, stop there. You know, it's the power at the end of the day, right? It's the power. I mean, if you have both up there male, the 2, 3, 4 female prosecutors, investigators, champions doing their job, but they also caught up with the power game there, and also, in the middle of, the whole thing. And that's the situation everywhere. So if we had, in an ideal world, like 50 investigators male, 50 female, prosecutor general female, and then the other police, male. Then in an ideal world, then we know, the real impact there. And then again, going back to your point, I really liked your point on fair system versus fair person. Of course, we need more ethics, more integrity, everybody should have it. But as an organization, for example, in UNDP, my ethics and my colleagues sitting there, Nariman ethics would be the same, because it's the organizational ethic, right? A person, maybe I am coming from Nepal, he's coming from Uzbekistan, or somebody, like Dennis coming from Peru. But as an organization, we have, we expect to behave in the same way. So that goes back to that fair system too. If the system is fair, then then many things can be in order. I mean, in right order. But if the system is not fair, 2, 3 champions, could be there, but they will also fall into the same victimization issue here. So that's why I think in the long term, we really need to strengthen the institution systems and a bit more systemic approach to the problem as well. And, entire ethics and integrity infrastructure too. We call about the infrastructure, meaning that the whistleblower protection, the conflict of interest issues, the asset declaration issues, the risk assessment you mentioned, different sectors. So these all puzzles have to be, coming together to be effective in the long term. We can reform police. We have seen in Haiti, right, after Aristide, who went to Central Africa, and then I think the US invested a lot, even providing training from LAPD and NYPD, and they demolished the military and they formed police. But after 2 years, police became as corrupt as other institutions too. What one organization can do when there is already, systemic corruption, endemic, pandemic, whatever we call it, it's difficult. So that's why I think that the system approach is very important, and it goes with the overall security environment in a country, overall power structure, accountability, check and balance is there or not. Yeah, so I think this is the more like a governance approach, you know, the system approach we will need it in the long term, and also the whistleblower protection, you know, and the witness protection regime. But that again goes back to power. You know, if there is a power grab in a country, then everything else, you know, becomes like a victim of that whole, you know, the oligarchy system or whatever system, we kleptocracy, whatever we call it.
Ursula, I'm very glad of your question because it addresses, we started the panel with the multidimensional aspect, actually, and we said what you said, like it's not just extortion, try to open your mind and see it in how those two topics, very broad topics, relate. So I think in order to organize that better, there's a relation, gender and or gender-related issues and corruption, but also gender and anti-corruption and what we need to do in our anti-corruption strategy. So it's one aspect of it is understanding the problem with the gender lens, but also our strategies with the gender lens. And what you have described happen in so many different aspects of law enforcement and in criminal investigation. We have that in organized crime and gender with prosecutors and investigators. We have that in so many different aspects, but also in the problem. For example, and I think in Guatemala, someone explained me, for example, when there's the situation of vote buying, for the political parties take advantage of women's leadership. So they are the ones that do the nasty work. They are the ones that talk because they are more approachable, they are all of this. So when you have to go to prison, women are the ones that go to prison because they are the direct person that committed the crime. And this happened with this type of crimes, which are political corruption. I mean, political parties doing this exploitation of leadership. So there's a big gap, actually, between like social leadership that you see in women and the next step in political formal participation. And you see that with extortion cases, with organized crime, using the role of women in order to commit extortion because they are more approachable, and micro, and this is something, for example, in Chile, to micro dealing with drugs. So they are, in many of our countries, those are the ones. So it is an invitation, what you're saying, to understand through these gender lenses the problem and the solutions that we have to address. And our anti-corruption strategies have to do that. I think Anja and Marcela depend on the aspects, but I think that's a form of organizing our conversation. And we have a lot of documents from IDB, from World Bank, different agencies of UN, like telling how to mainstream anti-corruption through their programs and agendas and all that. But again, I think that truly understanding and dimensioning what's going on, as what you have said, I have this specific situation with these prosecutors, is what we need in order to truly address the problems. It's not just having, because a lot of, I could answer you, like there are a lot of guidances and documents that tells you how to mainstream. There are like 10 steps. Yeah, but that's not it. Like what we do with these prosecutors, and that happened in anti-corruption, organized crime, and some other levels. So as you were discussing specific solutions, but yeah, that's kind of the scenario.
Thank you. I don't know, Maria, if you would like to have some remarks about it or something else to add. Do you have any other question? Yeah, I think we have a question over there, and there's another one.
Thank you. It's been very interesting to listen to this panel. My name is Sandra Martinez. I am from Colombian TA chapter. And one thing that was coming to my mind is last year we did this evaluation about Lima commitments. We did this in 19 countries of Latin America and the Caribbean region. One of the commitments, this was in 2018, was to advance the anti-corruption policies with that gender perspective. And this was one of the least evaluated commitments for all the 19 countries. And when we started seeing, it was something that for us was kind of striking, because perhaps there were some laws, but they didn't really know how to implement them. I mean, there is maybe like a gap in real, actual, practical things that you can really bring the gender perspective into the anti-corruption policies. So what I would like maybe to ask you is, if you would have, because I know you're saying there's a lot of literature and things that you will have to write, but I don't know if it's data or only data, or what could be like maybe 2 or 3 things like, this is something that we really all have to move forward and start like pressing our governments. If you're really gonna have an anti-corruption policy with a gender perspective, this has to be present. I would love to ask you that.
Thank you. Maybe we take another question and then I pass the mic to the panelists.
Hola,
Yes.
soy Mariana, miembro de México. Voy a hablar en español, lo siento, pero
It's
bueno,
okay.
me van a entender la mayoría de la mesa. Primero, agradecer este espacio. Es un oasis estar escuchándolas, porque me faltaba esto, me faltaba esta discusión incómoda, ¿no? De cómo la corrupción es transversal, así como el patriarcado nos atraviesa. Y yo agradezco muchísimo que pongan estos temas en la mesa, porque creo que es el elefante blanco del que nunca se quiere hablar. Entonces, y creo que hay mucho que decir, más allá de si las mujeres son más corruptas o no, etcétera. Me parece que hay un montón de cosas que abordar, ¿no? Y obviamente coincido con todas ustedes. El tema de las mujeres son más corruptas o no, pues obviamente los espacios se nos han negado, como se ha tocado en otras mesas, pero también creo que hay que hablar de que se requieren pues de una perspectiva feminista. Queremos… Ah, ok, disculpa.
Or maybe when I give the…
Ay, lo siento, perdónenme. Sí, ok. Bueno, entonces creo que sí es importante hablar de que necesitamos más mujeres en el poder, pero obviamente más mujeres con agenda feminista, con estos lentes de los que hablan ustedes, para poder abordar todos estos temas que nos atraviesan a las mujeres. Y creo que, bueno, alrededor de esta conferencia lo que he visto es que pues sí faltan estos lentes, ¿no? En estos temas, porque muchas veces las autoridades, incluso la sociedad civil o las personas que estamos en esta conferencia, confundimos esto de la perspectiva de género con casi cuántas mujeres, ¿no? A cuántas mujeres se atiende, cuántas mujeres no sé qué, o sea, muy cuantitativo, sin verdaderamente ir profundo, ¿no? Como dice Ana Solano, me parece que es un tema que cruza muchas dimensiones, ¿no? Como también lo dijo María, o sea, podemos empezar a hacer estos estudios de cómo afecta la corrupción a las mujeres en materia de salud, ¿no? En materia de educación, les diría en seguridad, obviamente en la militarización, por ejemplo, que vivimos en México, pero ustedes desde su perspectiva y desde sus lugares en donde están, ¿no? Siendo mujeres que están poniendo este tema en la agenda, ¿cómo le hacemos? O sea, ¿qué áreas de oportunidad ven ustedes de poder ir colocando más profundo este tema para que nuestras autoridades, nuestra sociedad civil y en general entendamos la gran urgencia de revisar nuestras violencias y el machismo profundo, que es el que en todas las historias que he escuchado en esta conferencia pues nos atraviesan a las mujeres, ¿no? Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much for bringing these topics to the table. I really appreciate this panel that has talked about different perspectives of how corruption affects women and different approaches that we need to take. We're in agreement in a lot of the things that had been exposed in here. And we also need, it's so important, the topic about if women are more or less corrupt than men is besides the point, because women are not really at the table when decisions are being taken. We have not taken those spaces, we have not been given those opportunities, but what we really need is a different perspective, a different lens to look at the importance of different topics and how the corruption affects women in a different way. So it's so important to talk not just about women having more power or women being in the agenda, but also having the position where we can see this from a different lens. We need to talk about these, about women in the different spaces, not only in the authorities, but also in the civil society, because we lack this lens. I'm so glad that women like you are in this conference bringing this topic to the table, because I don't think that there is a really deep understanding, neither from the authorities or from the social, from the civic society. People confuse gender issues with how many women are being addressed. It's not a qualitative issue, indeed. As Ana Solano mentioned before, we need really a deeper view of this, a deeper perspective, and we need to address this from with a different lens. And my question is, I'm so happy to hear this, because this corruption affects women in many spheres, in health, in education, and of course in the militarization that we are seeing in Mexico, for instance. So my question to you is, how can we bring this to the agenda? How these issues that affect women different can be addressed? What can we do at a deeper level to bring these topics both to the authorities and to the civil society, so that we can look at this, of these deep matchy societies that we inhabit, and also all these different violences in different levels and perspectives? What can we do to take this to the next level? And thank you so much for addressing these topics.
Thank you very much for the questions. And I have another question here from the virtual public. So I'm going to do it very quick, because I think the previous two questions are quite related, so maybe they can be addressed together. And the third question is, do we know if the prevalence in the Latin American region compares to other regions of the Global South? So I think I'll give the mic to Maria to start addressing the issues. I think well, first of all, I applaud that the Mexican colleagues said about the bringing this issue in this conference. I think that probably they were like two workshops in gender and corruption, and I think it's an issue that very evidently had to be addressed in a larger way. The questions, you had the questions before about the practical agenda and what can we do? Okay.
Thank you. Answering to Sandra and to Mariana, in TI Colombia, you have some studies also about the barriers from women to report and other issues, and they are very interesting. But I think that there's some things that I think that I would prioritize, for example. One of them is raising awareness. I think that, as Analinda said, of course, we need to strengthen our institutions, but we also have to raise awareness about this. For example, in Chile, we had in 2018, we have a feminist movement from students, because there was a lot of sexual harassment in universities or sexual comments, etc. And I think that we have to relate that also to corruption. So it's not, it's a double crime. So also to address that with corruption, and for example, that universities have better protocols about this. So I think that we need to raise awareness, raise awareness, raise awareness. Also, I think that we have to to repeat several times to the authorities that public policies in corruption are not neutral. They are not neutral, and we have a lot of agendas in Chile, and in none of this agenda there's been a gender perspective. And the third one, I think that we need more protection. We need to have some mechanism where women feel secure. For example, in the police, that there are women receiving the reports, not only men. So I think that we need to give them more protection. I think that there are some opportunities. For example, in Chile, we've seen that that women in the Chamber of Deputies, they have formed like a not feminist, but a gender perspective group where you can find from all the political parties, and they think very different in a lot of issues, but they promote together the quotas, for example, or the parity. So I think that there you have an opportunity. And also, as you were saying, it's not only a quantitative issue. These are not only numbers. There are stories and people behind this, and I think that we also have to show more that. Because at least in Chile, we love statistics. We are always saying 25% of 12%, but we don't see like the stories and the people behind that. And I think that we need these case stories to also show the importance and the relevance and the impact of these issues.
Yeah, I think this question because permit me to address a political will about these topics. Because for Lima platform, it was organization before to get this point in the agenda. Because at that time, it was politically right to have this topic in the agenda. However, in our countries, we have now some change and some political groups are not willing to put gender agenda in political issues. So this is something that we need to be alert, because gender issues sometimes are welcome, but other times, and now in Latin America, gender issues is maybe something that it will not have political will in people who have decisions. So to have it in the Lima platform, what is important and permit that we now go and say what happened next. But it is something that we need to be aware about. We need to do our work and to preserve this agreement, because time change and political will is not always the same. And in relation with Mariana's question about what we need to do, I think we need to continue understanding how violence against women have deep roots in structural discrimination, and in structural discrimination we can find corruption. And this is the reason for many impunities. Impunity, and this is very, very a strong message of the judicial power in our countries. And right now, in many of our countries in the judicial power, we are working with gender guidelines to change this. but civil society need to be alert because, how I already say, gender issues are sometimes not welcome for people who have political possibility to take decisions. So we need to put this point and to keep saying always in all this space that we need to understand the links between corruption, structural discrimination, and gender issues.
Thank you very much, Marcela. I think we get to the end. I wanted to give Anga just one minute to address the last question very quick, and then that will be the end of it.
I think that's the excellent question from a colleague from Mexico. You know, on gender issues, even if we look at the policies, anti-corruption framework, this and that, the colleague from the Columbia TI mentioned, most of the time, if gender is mentioned, it's a lip service, men and women, you know, without looking deeper into how it impacts, you know, or, you know, whether there is representation or not. If you look at the Anti-Corruption Commission in 143 countries, I yesterday checked the data, only 4 or 5 women are there. So it's also about, you know, representation, participation in decision making. It's not just about framework and men and women there. So I think we are quite getting a long way on gender budgeting, for example. You know, initially gender budgeting was how much we spend for men and women, but now it's more. It's a participation, it's a representation, it's decision making. So I think we need to do same on anti-corruption frameworks and policies. We make it more mandatory in terms of reporting and so on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anga, and thank you very much to all our panelists, and thank to you for joining our workshop today.